welcome to the first Jadu Masterclass. Today we're going to be looking at the basic tools in the content management side of Central that you can use for managing workflow, so effectively content approval. So there's a basic sort of two-step workflow process that comes out of the box for content types, which I'm sure those of you who've used the content management side of the platform before will be familiar with. But we will run through that in a bit of detail just so that people who maybe not be familiar with it get a bit of an overview. And also, we'll then take a deeper dive into how you can use the workflow module to create custom workflows for different groups of users, different types of content, and also how you can use that workflow module to override people's generic privileges. So, for example, you had a user who generally you wanted all of their content to go through approval, but maybe you had one type of content like news where you wanted them to be able to approve their own news, how you can use workflow to override their general privileges so that they can do that. I'm logged in this screen as Dave, who's a web manager. And then I've also got another browser open where I'm logged in as Bob, who's a content author. So in terms of default privileges, as they come out of the box, Bob is classed as an administrator, which means that he can create content, but he can't approve it. And Dave is a webmaster, which means he can create content and he can approve content. And as a web manager, any content that Bob creates or any other administrators create would go into Dave's workflow, or any other webmasters within the system. It will go into their standard workflow. So effectively, it's one shared workflow queue across all webmasters in terms of the standard out-of-the-box workflow. So if I go into Bob's profile, let's say he goes in and edits and updates this item of content. When he's made his changes, he needs to submit it for approval. When he submits it, he has the option to put a note in for his reviewer. So I'll put something in there. And I can then, as Bob, send that task for approval. Once I've sent it, at the top of the item in the control center, I'll be able to see what the messages that I've sent. I've got an option to view the content history, so I'll be able to see a timeline of who's edited that item of content and when it's been edited. And also, I've got the option to cancel my approval request. So if I go back to Dave, so Bob has submitted his content for approval. When Dave logs in, or any user logs in, it will tell them how many tasks they have outstanding. So in terms of workflow, a task outstanding is something that's sitting in your workflow queue, waiting for you to do something with it. If you have a task awaiting action, then that's something that's in your workflow, but it's something you've asked someone else to do. So if Bob logged in now, it would probably tell him that he's got one task awaiting action because he's waiting for Dave to go in and approve his content. Whereas Dave has got, as a webmaster, 4 tasks outstanding, which probably means there's been a number of people submitting content to him for approval. So if I go up and click on drop-down menu where it says Dave, this gives you access to the task list. So when Dave goes to his tasks, you'll see a list of tasks awaiting approval. And at the bottom of the list, he can see Bob's task with a message to approve his content. So as Dave, the webmaster, I can go into that content. I could go in and preview it. I could take a look at it. I could have a look at the track changes if there's been previous versions of it. And I can either approve or reject it. If I reject it, I can put my message in telling Bob why I'm rejecting that item of content. I don't know, let's put something in there. If I reject that item of content, for me, that's now, as Dave, that's now a task awaiting action. So if I go back to my main initial login screen, I can see that I've got one task awaiting action. And if I went to my task list, I can go to the awaiting action tab. And in there, I can see that I'm waiting for Bob to go in and check his spelling. If I go over to Bob's screen, I log in. I can see I've got one task awaiting action. I've no longer got a task, sorry, one task outstanding. I've no longer got a task awaiting action because my item of content that I sent for approval has been actioned, but it's been sent back to me. So if I go to my task list as Bob, I can see that my document's been returned to me for editing, and I can see that I've been told to check my spelling. Now, if I want to receive a notification of any workflow actions that are triggered that relate to me, I can go into my settings here and I can enable email alerts. And I could check the box to say, email me on workflow events. So if I save those changes, whenever an item of content that I send for approval is either rejected or approved, I will receive a notification of that action. So if I go back into my content, okay, I've got my message there saying what I need to do. So I could go in and make those changes. And then when I'm happy, I could resubmit my content for approval. I'll put my message in. And I can send that back for approval. So again, if I go back to Dave's login, if I go to his task list now, I can see that Bob has sent his document back through for approval. And this time I can go in and approve that change. So I could check it, happy with it. So I'll click approve and publish. If that content hasn't been approved or made live before, I will get this option to make it live. So I can make it live. That publishes it to the website. Making something visible will generate a dynamic link to it on any relevant category pages that are associated with that document where there hasn't been a category homepage activated. So this is really making it visible in the dynamic navigation that the system manages. If I go in and view that live now, you'll see if I go to my fitness category, there's a dynamic link there that's been populated. If this document was invisible, then that link wouldn't appear at that category level. So that's effectively the basic two-step workflow that applies to content out of the box. If you want to build custom workflows, then there is a tool under utilities called Workflow that allows you to do a number of different things. So if I go into Workflow, you'll see at the moment I've got the standard workflow. If I go to Actions, I have the option to enable Advanced Workflow. Now, Advanced Workflow is effectively gives you the ability to build custom workflows within the platform. So even if I enable Advanced Workflow, if I haven't built any custom workflows, the standard workflow will still be the workflow that's applied to content. But as soon as I build a custom workflow, Any users who are in that custom workflow and any criteria I've applied to that custom workflow will then come into play. So we'll come back here in a moment and I'll show you how to build a custom workflow. Privilege levels. There's 2 privilege levels that come out of the box. You do have the ability to create new privilege levels, but I tend to think that normally you wouldn't necessarily need them. All these really affect is whether someone can approve content or not. So if you wanted people to have different roles within the system, it may be that you don't need to create a new privilege level, but you would potentially go into admin privileges and set up a role that then governs all of their privileges. So really, when we're talking in terms of privilege levels, we're just talking about whether in the default workflow, someone has the ability to approve content or not. So it's fairly rare that you'd ever need to create a new privilege level. If you do create a new privilege level, the one thing that you do need to make sure on this screen is that the role that you want to be the role responsible for approving content in the default workflow is at the bottom of the list. And you've got positioning arrows that you can use to move things up and down. In terms of privilege groups, by default, there is an all users group, but you can create new privilege groups as a way of, I guess, organizing users within the system to make managing custom workflows a little bit more easy. So let's say I want to create a privilege group that contains all of my content authors who work in the leisure department. I'll create a new privilege group. I'll give it a name. Let's call it leisure team. I can assign a category to my privilege group. Now, this is optional, but what this does is if, for example, you have a user who is going to be potentially a member of multiple groups, assigning a category to the user group gives the system a way of determining which group that user should be part of, depending on which category they are publishing to. So if I added leisure and culture to this group, and let's include the child categories as well. When I apply that, the system, if someone is creating an item of content, and if maybe they're in 2 different user groups, they'll look at that category. And if it's one of the users that add to this and they're publishing to leisure and culture, it'll go, oh, they're part of that user group. Therefore, we need to apply this workflow to them, which I haven't built yet. We'll do that in a moment. So I'm going to add in here a number of users. Let's put four users in there. So these are my content authors who work within the leisure team. I could save that as a group. I might create another privileged group for the web managers. And I could go in here. No, don't need to add a category because these are web managers who are going to be approving everything. And I'll go in and add them in. So let's add Dave in. So I'll have my 2 web managers in who will be responsible for approving content. So now, at the moment, although I've enabled advanced workflow and I've created a couple of custom user groups, the standard workflow will still be the workflow that applies to those users out of the box. Now, let's say what I want to do in this example is I want to create a workflow that's maybe a 3-step workflow. So maybe the leisure team have got some new users and some more advanced users in the team. So we want the new users to be able to send their content to the more experienced users within their team before it's then sent to the web managers for final publication. So I'm going to go into the Manage tab. I'm going to double check that advanced workflow is enabled. and I'm going to create a new workflow. I'll give my workflow a name. Let's call it leisure content. And then this takes me into the workflow designer. So the first thing I need to do is add any groups of users to the workflow that I potentially want to use within the workflow itself. Adding a user group to a workflow doesn't automatically mean that the users in that group are part of that workflow. The admin groups are really a way of just, as I said before, organizing users into smaller groups to make it easier for managing things. So if I click on Manage Admin Groups, I want to put the Web Managers group and the Leisure Team group into this workflow. So I'm going to save that. At the moment, I've got a two-step workflow here. I want this to be a three-step workflow. So I'm going to add a step in. And really what I want it to do is I want it to run from an administrator to an administrator to a webmaster, with my new administrators at step 1, my more experienced administrators at step 2, and then my web managers at step 3. So now I've got roles or privilege levels assigned to each step. I can go in and I can select the users who have that privilege level, who sit within groups assigned to the workflow. I can assign the individual users to their appropriate positions within the workflow. So let's say that Edna and Adrian are our two new users, and Claire and Bob are our more experienced users. So when Edna and Adrian create an item of content, rather than that going straight to a web manager as it would in the default workflow, it would go up to Claire and Bob for approval. And then in my last step, I'll add the two web managers in. I can then decide what content types the workflow should be applied to. So on the basis that this is going to be sort of general day-to-day content, I'm going to put document pages and downloads in there. I'm just going to save this as I go. There's also a way of managing alerts within workflow. So you can set a system of alerts so that if something's in workflow and it's not being actioned, the system can send email prompts to nominated users to get that item moving through the workflow. And you can also set sort of an escalation level where you can actually then just directly reassign a piece of content that's not been actioned to a specific user or group of users. So if I went into manage alerts, I can say I want to use alerts and I want to send emails. So there's two levels of alert. There's amber and red. So I might say if something's still sitting in workflow after a day, if I highlight people, if I hold down Control or Command, I can highlight all the users in that group. So I'm going to say, actually, if something's still in workflow after a day, we're just going to send a notification to everyone in that workflow so that someone can either go in and action it if it's at their level, or they can prompt someone if it's at the next level up. What I might say is after 2 days, what we're going to do is we're going to actually prompt the web managers so they can start chasing it. So I'm going to choose Irene and Dave at that level. So there's an amber alert sent after 1 day, a red alert sent after 2 days. And I could then say after 3 days, we're just going to escalate the task and we're going to directly assign it to Irene and Dave as web managers. So even if it's stuck at level 2, it's going to jump that and send it straight to the web managers for approval. You have an option as well of locking content as it goes through workflow. So if I switch that on, if something is sent to step 2, that content will be locked. So no one at step 1 or step 3 would be able to access that content until it's been dealt with at step 2. And there isn't an override on that. So it would require someone that content's assigned to go in and action it. The only way it would be overridden would be if it's then escalated to the next level. So you can decide, on a workflow by workflow basis, if you want to lock that content. And then you've got a live toggle. So if you're happy with your workflow, you can switch it on to make it live in the system. So if I do that. So the way this workflow works in terms of content approval is Edna and Adrian can create content at step 1 and submit it to Claire and Bob for approval at step 2. Claire and Bob can approve content and pass it up the line to Irene and Dave, or they can reject content and pass it back to Edna or Adrian, whoever created the content. They can also create content, but because they're the more experienced users and they're at step 2, when they create an item of content, it just goes up the 1 step to Irene and Dave. Irene and Dave can approve content and publish it, or they can reject it back down to step 2 if it needs further action. So if I go into Dave's login, let's go back into my item of content. Yes, 12 is the maximum amount of days. I think 12 days for something to be stuck in workflow would be fairly near the mark in terms of wanting to get something approved. So, okay, so I'm now editing my piece of content as Bob. You can see I've got a new button that's appeared that says collaborate. I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. When I submit an item of content, the interface will have changed slightly as well. So when I click submit, I still have my option for putting some notes in, but I also have the option of either sending it up using the default setting, which, because I'm in a custom workflow, will send my item of content for approval to Dave and Irene. Or if I know that one or the other of them specifically needs to look at this content, I can select one of them. So this corresponds with me being at step 2 in the workflow. If I change this a bit, so let's take Bob out of step 2, and we'll take Adrian out of step 1. We'll swap them around. Save that workflow. I go back into that item. When I submit it now, you'll see that it will have changed. So I don't get Dave and Irene now, I get Adrian and Claire, because I'm at step 1 and they're at step 2, as opposed to me being at step 2 and passing it up to step 3. But again, I can either send it to both of them or one of them if I know there's one of them in particular that needs to look at that item. And in terms of approving the content or rejecting it, it's the same process. So you can approve it and reject it, add your note in, and it goes wherever it needs to go next. If you approve an item at step 2, you then have to submit it to step 3. It doesn't happen automatically as well. Now, in terms of this additional button that's appeared, when you're in a custom workflow, as well as being able to send stuff sort of vertically through the workflow, you can also collaborate horizontally with anyone at the same level as you in the workflow. So, for example, Edna could create a piece of content, but she could then submit it to Bob as a collaboration task to add his content to it, or maybe finish it off if she's going on leave or something like that. So if I come back to my login as Bob, if I click collaborate, if there's multiple people at the same level, I could just, and I just want any of them to pick it up, I can submit it to anybody. Or if I want it to go to Edna, I can submit it to Edna as a collaboration task. So I'll put a message in there. I can submit that as a collaboration task. So that would go into Irene's task list. Sorry, not Irene, Edna's task list. So if I go in and sign in as Edna, change my password. I go to my tasks, you can see I've got a collaboration task. Don't know what's happened to my message there. It's a bit strange. I might have to raise that as a bug. But I can go in and collaborate on this content. So I can go into cycling and fitness, and I can go in and make my changes. Once I'm happy with my changes, just go back into it. I could then either send it back to Bob and say, I've done what I need to do. Do you want to just review it? Or I can submit it to the next level. So those custom workflows have sort of the approval process going steps 1, 2, and 3, and then collaboration within the same level of workflow. So I've got a question from Leanne. Does anything flag in the system if an administrator or admin user that's in a workflow is disabled or deleted? No, there isn't a flag at the moment. So I don't believe that would be flagged in any way. If that's something that you feel would be required, it can always be raised as a feature request via our feature request system, and then the product team will look at that and determine whether it's something that should be worked into the platform in a future release. Okay. So that's the basic principles of kind of the standard things you'd want to do with workflow. The other thing that you can do with workflow is you can use workflow as a way of overriding default privileges. So if I go in and look at the privilege settings that I've applied to my authors, so you can see my authors are all set up as generic content authors, leisure team, which is a role in the system. And if I go in there and take a look, you'll see that I've given them access to document pages, downloads, and news. So at the moment, with my custom workflow I've built, any document pages or downloads that they create will have to go through that custom workflow. But because I didn't add news into my custom workflow, if any of those 4 authors created a news story, that would go through the standard out-of-the-box workflow. But let's say, for example, what we really want to do is maybe allow them to approve their own news stories. Or maybe we just want Bob to be able to approve his own news stories. We're more concerned about the more kind of potentially content that customers are going to be interacting with to be sort of going through workflow, whereas news we're a bit more lenient with. So what I want to do is I want to create a custom workflow so that when Bob creates a news story, he can approve it himself. So if I just jump in here, if I go to publishing and news, we'll do it on Edna's login, save me logging in and out. I'm going to create a new news article. I'll assign category to it. Pick leisure and culture. I'm just going to cheat a little bit with this. So I've created my news story. I'm going to save it. So at the moment, I have to submit it. And when I submit it, I send it for approval and it goes off into Web Manager's task list. Let me cancel that. Now, what we want to do is we want Edna to be able to approve her own news stories rather than it going off to someone else's task list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to utilities. I'm going to go into workflow. I'm going to create a new workflow. Just so I know what I'm doing, I'm just going to call this Edna News. I'll save that. I'm going to add my leisure team group to my workflow. I'm going to say it's relating to news. And I'm going to add Edna in at step 1, because Edna's going to be creating the content. Now, what you'll notice is I can't add her to step 2 because she's already in the workflow. So if we want Edna to approve her own content for news, what we have to do is we remove step 2. So it effectively becomes a single-step workflow. If I make that live and then save it, in theory, what should now happen is if Edna creates or edits a news story, when she submits it for approval, she will have the option to approve it herself. I'm just going to jump back, go into her news story. I'm going to submit it for approval. You can see she's now got the option to approve or reject it. I'm assuming she wouldn't reject her own content, but Edna could then go in and approve that item and publish it. So even though her default privilege level doesn't let her approve anything, we're using a custom one-step workflow to override that for one specific content type. Okay. So I'm just going to go back to my other workflow because we've got a question about that one. So what would happen if, in your example, both Claire and Adrian are no longer active users? I believe that would break the workflow because there wouldn't be anybody left at step 2. So it is something to be aware of, that if you disable a user, you should check whether they're part of any custom workflow. Is there a way to submit and approve in one step for editors that are authorized to approve their own content? No, there's not a way of being able to do that. It's a 2-step process. So those are sort of all of the core functions of workflow. So we've shown you the default two-step workflow that comes out of the box. We've shown you how to build a custom workflow where you need potentially multiple steps with different users at each step. The other thing just to be aware of is if you're in a custom workflow, it doesn't really matter what your privilege level is. It's your position in your workflow that governs what rights you have when content's going through that workflow. So yeah, in theory, you could have a workflow where it goes from an administrator to a webmaster to another administrator. And in that workflow, it's the administrator that has final say. So just be aware of that. So we've shown you how to create those multi-step workflows, and we've also talked about how you can use workflow to override individual privilege levels as well. Okay, I've got another question. Is there a way to know which users are part of which workflow without going into the workflow? There isn't, I don't believe, at the moment. I can check whether that's something on the roadmap. Okay, so if anybody else has any other questions, if you want to pop them into the chat or the Q&A window, give everyone a moment or two to put anything in that they may need to ask. Are there any plans to have forms page templates as a content type option in the workflow settings? I'm not aware of that, but I will check with the product team. I know that it's something that's been asked before, so it may well be something that's already in the feature suggestions. So I'll take a look at that. Alison, is there a way to turn off the email alerts on behalf of an administrator? No, they have to turn them on and off themselves. There isn't a way of doing it on their behalf. Question from Debbie, are directories included in workflow? No, there's no workflow in directories. The only workflow in directories is if it's a submission that's come from a member of the public into the directory. There's no workflow within as such within the control center for directories if it's content that staff are creating. Okay, so no other questions. Okay, well, I hope you found that session useful. But thank you for your time today. If there's no more questions, we'll finish up for the afternoon. But thank you all.